Well, for months, we've been saying, indeed, when I've spoken to you on this show, that one of Russia's biggest problems is manpower. It's a loss of manpower they experienced in the first phase of this conflict. They may have lost over 60, 70,000 people overall, killed and wounded in the course of this war. Many of their battalions are gravely under strength. And it's that manpower problem that allowed Ukraine to find a weak spot in the Russian lines and make those spectacular advances in Kharkiv province in the northeast a few weeks ago. And therefore, if all of that is correct, I think it's fair to say if they can mobilize an additional 300,000 people, as Sergei Shoigu, Russia's defense minister, said alongside Putin this morning, that would make a substantial difference to Russia's military capability on the ground. I think there's no denying it. But, and there is a huge but, their ability to generate that force and to equip it and arm it and officer it, I think, is in some substantial doubt.
And that's what I want to explore further. I mean, Putin is talking about deploying them today. How is that going to be possible? Will they be able to physically get these troops onto the ground where they are needed?
What Putin said was that only those with prior military service, and indeed what Shoigu added was those with combat experience, would be deployed, would be called up and deployed. So these are people who have some level of basic training. Putin did say they would receive some additional training. I think the immediate effects could be felt within weeks or months. I don't think days, because of course, you have to pull these people in, give them their orders, their uniforms, some very basic procedural things. But weeks or months is plausible, and you can begin feeding them in to those existing battalions that are gravely under strength, some of them operating at 30, 40% of the level of manpower they expect and need. That would have a very quick effect. The full effect, I would emphasize, is only going to be felt in 2023, perhaps some way into next year, because you'll need to do lots more training, building new units, all of those things. So the full effect, I think, is only going to be well into next year.
So how critical is the response now from Ukraine?
I have to say, not very critical. And the reason is Ukraine's going to be doing what they've been doing for the last few months, which is to say, continuing to absorb Western weapons, receiving Western ammunition, getting training in the UK with help of instructors from many countries, including Australia, and pressing on with their gains in the northeast. In fact, in the last few days, we have seen them make some important gains, a small settlement in Luhansk province, which lies just to the south of Kharkiv province. And what's important about that is that Vladimir Putin said in July that he had conquered Luhansk. They had spent many months of bitter fighting, taking the last city in Luhansk, Severodonetsk. And for Ukraine to be threatening that again, I think is a really severe blow. And of course, they're also pressing those Russian units in the south in Kherson by attriting them and shutting off their means of resupply over bridges. For Ukraine, none of this mobilization changes the fact that they have to keep on doing that, although perhaps it highlights the sense, Bev, that there is a window of opportunity for them to make these gains before Russia's manpower problems perhaps begin to abate at some point in the spring of next year or beyond.
Yeah. We've talked before, Shashank, about a possible nuclear response. We got more rhetoric and veiled threats from Vladimir Putin today. Do you think that has shifted the dynamic?
I think it has to a degree, and there's two things to bear in mind here. First of all, Russia threatening to use nuclear weapons in cases of threat to its own territory, or what it perceives as its own territory. And we've seen that, for example, with Dmitry Medvedev, a former president, issuing threats over the status of Crimea, which was annexed illegally by Russia in 2014. What makes these threats so significant now is two things. One of them is that Putin is losing this conflict, and a more desperate leader is one who may be more inclined to make reckless decisions. The other important point is that he also announced, at the same time as his decision on partial mobilization, the announcement that he would endorse the referendums to be held in Russian-occupied provinces of Ukraine, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk, which the latter two making up Donbass, which are effectively transparent attempts to annex these territories to Russia. In other words, a war of conquest, absorbing these territories into Russia. And if that happens, what the Kremlin can then say, however plausibly or implausibly, is that, look, Ukraine is now not just attacking Ukrainian territory, it's attacking Russian soil that used to be Ukraine but now is ours. And therefore, nuclear weapons may come into play. Now, you can argue that's a bluff. You can argue that's not plausible or realistic, but I think it will cause a degree of introspection and concern among Western officials about the decisions that Putin might then take to avoid a devastating loss of his position in Donbass.
Yes, because we could really hear today in his response that he is making claims that are not based in fact in any sense. So that is not out of the realms of possibility, despite the fact that the UN General Assembly has roundly condemned any referendum going ahead, and in fact this new mobilisation. Is there any nation that can effectively have any sway over Putin, or do you think he's just, throwing all caution to the wind at this point?
Well, he's in dire straits, and that's guiding his decision making. But as for international partners, I think that's a really important question to ask, because in the past week, we've seen 3 separate interventions from countries that are either close to Russia or have been sympathetic to its policy. And I would point to China, India and Turkey, because at the Shanghai Cooperation Summit last week, we saw Putin acknowledge concerns he said had been offered to him by Chinese leaders. We saw India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi suggest that he had reservations about this conflict. He said it's not a time for war, is what he's told Mr. Putin. And of course, India has been buying substantial amounts of Russian oil and is a major purchaser of Russian arms. And then in the last few days, we saw Recep Tayyip Erdogan say that Russia wanted to end the war, which was to be expected. Turkey has made these kind of sympathetic statements. But he also said Russia would have to return all the territory captured to Ukraine, which is a very important and consequential statement coming from a leader who has fundamentally been quite pro-Putin at many different points in this conflict. So I think we're looking at a Russian leadership that is internationally isolated, but I'm afraid I don't see that making much impact on Russian decision making, because it clearly did not dissuade Putin from making this decision to mobilize today.
Yeah, which almost goes against all of those issues, as you say. But just a really interesting turn today. I appreciate your time as always. Thank you.
Thanks.